Hi, Amaya. How are you?
I am doing really well, Doug. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
No worries. But hey, just before we get into it, I just read a very recent article that has turned my world upside down. It turns out historians have traced the origin of fart jokes to ancient Egypt. Yeah, it turns out they all had a toot in common. Oh my God, everybody. I am so sorry. Hey, welcome to What
Such a
Magic Is
terrible
This?
joke.
A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and we have a very special show for everybody today. Now, this was a topic that was picked by the Patreon supporters. I put up on the Patreon account a list of about 15 topics, and they got to choose. And this was one of those topics that was put up there that I was so excited to talk about because this thing is my jam. But I wanted to have somebody special on the show as I love her perspectives, and she knows a hell of a lot more about astrology and the stars than I do. She's an animist, a necromantic folk witch, an astrological magician, and a herbalist in training who is fascinated in equal measure by both our natural world and the hypnotic night sky, crushing more astrological consultations per week than what might be healthy. I am joined by Amaya Rourke. Amaya, how are you?
Thank you, Doug. That was such a generous introduction. I'm doing so well. And like I said a minute ago, I'm very excited to be here. I've been looking forward to it for like 3 weeks. I was like, oh, it's not soon enough.
Oh, thank you. Well, no, it's when I put this up on the Patreon, I was like, man, I really hope people pick this. And I was actually quite surprised. I had things in there like tarot and witchcraft, and those got very little votes. But this one was one. I think this was the third most popular choice that people chose. So through my scanning on things like Twitter, I always enjoy when you have these threads up on Twitter where you talk about things like decans and whatnot, and they're really quite wonderful. So I had to have you on the show. So let's get into it. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Perfect. So we're going to be talking about the ancients and the stars in this episode. How people before I'm going to try and put a an end cap on this at pretty much the end of the Hellenistic age. We might dip a little bit into the first couple of centuries every once in a while, but I'd like to kind of end it at maybe 31 BC when the Hellenistic era, we're considering it came to a close in and around there. But anything before then is fair game. I want to put this question to you first, Amaya. It is said that to study the night sky is to study stories. Would you agree with this?
Absolutely. That is how we oriented ourselves in time and space and tried to make sense of how and why we should do things. It's much deeper than just a story. The human brain works best on like metaphor and pictures.
Mm.
And so when we try to just do like cold, hard facts, we don't actually recall it that well. And the ancients kind of tapped into that very quickly. They didn't really know what facts were, that wasn't a thing quite yet. And they were like, stories are how we exist and where we exist and why we exist. But it was so scientific to them. This is how
Mhm.
they were describing when you should plant your crops or when you should give offerings to your gods, even how to be hygienic. Like it
Mhm.
was very complex. It wasn't this simple thing. And it wasn't just superstition, which is what a lot of historians have kind of narrowed it down to is, oh, it's just silly superstition. So they don't really go into it.
Right. In doing research for this episode, the stars were used for so many things. My favorite one that I came across was that they were our earliest optometrist charts. They would actually put people out in the night sky and tell them to look up at the night sky. And if they couldn't see a certain star, they knew that maybe their vision was fading. So yeah, it's just absolutely wonderful. I got to ask, though, Amaya, what is your favorite story of how the stars came to be the stars in the
Oh
sky?
gosh. I actually have a few of them because right now I'm really on a snake kick. Snakes,
Okay.
serpents, dragons. Obviously, the rainbow serpent of the indigenous Australians. There was a goddess that was awakened named Yi, and she had a lot to do with the sky. There was also the magpies that introduced the dawn. They would tear open the sky. I really love how animistic the Aboriginals were because, first of all, there's not a lot of, there's some stories of conquering, but more of it is about relationships. So, like the rainbow serpent slithering across the world and carving out the land, and
Mm.
then calling up the frogs and causing them to, begin singing so that the waters would fill these spaces. And I think that's just a really beautiful way of looking at things, very different from what you find in the Western tradition. But I also do really love the Babylonian myth of like Tiamat and Anu,
Mm.
as well as the Mayan myth of the plumed serpent. So, like, there's a lot of myths around snakes in the sky.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, honestly. Even you go into the Greeks, and you had, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but Ladon, who was guardian of the Hesperide. And the Hesperides was the upper culmination of the heavens where the tree of life and the waters of life came from. So there's all these snakes and serpents that are connected with the sky, which is interesting considering what happened in late antiquity with snakes and how they became this really evil thing. So, especially with Christianity, but there were other religions that did the same. It's just fascinating to me, but I also have an affinity for like snakes and snake women, so that's probably why I'm into it.
I hear you. It's funny, the things that we really resonate with are usually the stories that we're so enamored by. For myself, I've always enjoyed dogs, wolves, and coyotes. So my favorite tale of how the stars came to be comes from the Navajo, in which Black God was arranging the night sky, but he had a little pouch in which he was keeping the stars. The stars were going to be put in a somewhat ordered fashion, like the constellations that we have now. And he took a bit of a break, and Coyote came and, thinking that there was food in the pouch, grabbed the pouch and ran away with it. As the coyote ran, the bag ripped open, spilling the stars across the sky. And the reason that coyotes howl at night is as an apology to Black God for crossing him. So that's always so wonderful to me. I just love that story. It's just so fantastic. Now, how important do you think the night sky was to our pre-civilization ancestors? I think you kind of answered it in a little bit, but maybe we can get a bit more technical.
Well, I mean, it was incredibly formative. It really did help us with understanding like timing. It was our earliest calendar. They've actually been able to connect the fact that these Paleolithic art that we find in the caves are actually often constellations, and it was an advanced calendar. And that's been a new thing because we thought that that wasn't really happening until around 4000 BCE. And it actually turns out probably going back 10, maybe even up to 40,000 years.
Yeah.
And that's pretty wild that they were looking up at the sky and kind of tracking things. Like I said, it really had a lot to do with, at that time, would have been hunter and gatherers. So like when you could go and actually get the plants that were available to you in your landscape.
Right.
Also, when you need to start collecting food and putting it aside or moving on to the next place. Because if you saw the stars shift to a specific part of the sky, you'd be like, oh, it's time. It's going to get really cold. We're not going to survive this. Time to make our way somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
I think the most beautiful thing about it, though, is like it's really reflected all around the globe, and it transcends space and time and different cultures. And it's amazing to see how much overlaps. From what we know, at least, they really had no contact with one another. So you find like the method of parents that the Egyptians were doing was also being done by the Incans. Was also being done by the Chinese, probably done by the Russians. We're still waiting for some translations on that, but I have a few friends starting to get into it, and they're like, yeah, they were using it too.
Very cool.
So they were all using a very similar method. It's amazing. They all figured out how to do it. You can actually measure these things with your hands if you're looking up in a very clear sky. Difficult to do if you live in a city.
Yeah.
And they all figured it out. And that's pretty amazing. That's kind of the thing that connects all of us and transcends our differences, is that we all have the same sky, maybe a different orientation with it because of our location. But I mean, it's fascinating to see like in a lot of different places that similar stars, similar names, similar animals attributed to them, even similar magical qualities. And so it's probably the number one thing that I think history has really botched when we go to try to figure this stuff out. You don't learn about any of this in school. You learn about religions, but this predates religion. And it became a religion eventually for most of these places. But we don't pay attention to that because it's just silly superstition.
Right. The clusterfuck that are historians and scholars that try to go through this stuff. One of my favorites was a bone that was found in one of the caves in France. And it had a very, very obvious markings for our lunar cycle. But of course, that's what it wasn't used for. Of course, it was used for some kind of weapon. It's like it shows a very clear path on this bone of the lunar phase. But still, no, why would they? They wouldn't need that. Or if they needed, it would be to a small extent. It's like the reason that this survives is because it was important, right?
Pretty crazy, honestly. You think about it, right? Like it really is just... When I started getting into the history of this, because, a lot of astrology today, modern astrology, doesn't really go into history too much. It just goes into modern interpretation. So when I started studying ancient astrology, as a very Saturnian person, first of all, it gave me a complete existential crisis because my big thing is mastery. And I was like, thought that I was really good at astrology. Then I get into ancient astrology. I'm like, I know nothing. Right. I am nothing. Like, I cannot give consultations anymore. I took several years off because I was just like, I don't know enough. And I don't want to lead people in a way that feels misleading or undereducated. And so when I start getting into it, it was just this rabbit hole that keeps going and going and going. And it's not covered at any point in my education, in early education in America, or even my college education. Not once was it talked about. And it's really mind blowing because it had such an effect. Like, it really did give us the basis for a lot of our scientific practices today. It gave us so many beginnings to so many religions. It's reflected, in fact, in the Bible several times. There are multiple different metaphors and allegories to different stars and planets that you would only know if you went down this rabbit hole. And none of it's covered. None of it is talked about. None of it is even acknowledged. Most of it is just like, yeah, they were doing stuff with the stars and it was a silly superstition. Literally, that's what you'll see in these books. So you get into like people who are looking at this from a classical standpoint, everything shifts for you, because now you can kind of see like we had this inherent connection between the stars and Earth, which is kind of the beauty of it. And we're missing that because we aren't taught it anymore. And in fact, we're missing it in a lot of modern astrology because we don't teach it in modern astrology. A lot of that is like psychological assessment. So it takes going deep. I'm really grateful to people like Chris Brennan and Robert Hand and all them, because they're the reason we even have any of this. If we didn't have them, nothing would be here right now. I would not be able to talk about any of this.
Right. Our Neolithic and Paleolithic, or Paleolithic and Neolithic ancestors, you say that it was also used for seasons, but is there anything else that they would use it for? Was it used in ceremony? Because I'm pretty sure that.
Well, I think a lot of it is at this point speculative, right? Because that's the problem with a lot of these, and that's actually, I think we talked about in our notes originally, like, why is it that science doesn't really want to acknowledge any of this? Why is it that scholarly people don't want to acknowledge any of this? And that part of the problem is that we're talking about speculation. Now, we can make some pretty good deductions, right? So you can definitely tell based off of, different ways that they've timed things and looked at tree rings and all that. Like, they definitely were holding ceremonies around moon cycles. Yeah. Seems that they may have also, especially like if you look at like Stonehenge and places like that, they definitely had lined up all those stones for both lunar and solar phases. And then you get to Egypt, and some of their pyramids are actually pointing up at specific culminations of stars. The Great Pyramid in particular, some say it was pointing at Thuban at one point, but actually it's more likely it was pointing at the heliacal culmination of Sirius, which was the most important star in the night sky to them.
Absolutely.
So they were doing a lot of stuff around the stars and the planets that is not really written about anymore. And it's considered so speculative that it's fringe if you are an academic and you want to talk about this. Now, we're really lucky. They're starting to open up more. Like, I look at Jeffrey Koitik, who's doing the work of basically reconstructing a lot of where Chinese astrology came from and its interplay with the West. And that's been amazing to watch. He puts out papers, I swear to God, like once a month, every month. He's prolific. Yeah. And I'm starting to get into more of like the Chinese lore right now for my own spiritual purposes. And it's wild, right? Them and the Babylonians track the stars so closely. Really, really closely. The Egyptians did too, but really the Babylonians and the Chinese really kept immaculate records. Like, they were kind of obsessed. And it's been a huge boon to those of us who are interested in that because it still exists. Whereas you go back far enough in the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, it's difficult because we have cave paintings and we have tools that obviously indicate this was used for stellar purposes or lunar purposes. But that's all we have. And we're kind of piecing it together. And that's why a lot of academics just ignore it. Because they're like, where's the evidence? Where's the paper? And it's like, well, a lot of these civilizations didn't have that. So it would seem like a silly thing to kind of expect that as a rigorous form of academia if that wasn't even in existence at that point.
Yeah, it's funny when, to speak upon something like Egypt, most scholars don't even recognize the fact that, which is considered pretty much canon if you're studying Egyptology, is that the myth of Osiris and Osiris's resurrection, they didn't write that shit down. That was one of those stories that everybody knew, right? There was
cultural.
There was no need for them to write it down, but it's still, we can take that and be like, oh, this is definitely what happened. But that came from speculation and things that we saw. But we don't have like a text that they can literally say, oh, this is the myth of Osiris. We had to extrapolate different areas of evidence to be able to know that this is the story itself. We consider that totally fine, but everything else is just like, nah, it's all speculation. It's like, but a lot of the things that we know were very important to certain cultures, that wasn't written down either. So it's one of those things that just frustrates me. Now, to speak on the rabbit hole that you talked about previously, For this episode, we're going to be looking at more specifically about 3 cultures to just keep things somewhat honed down. I apologize to everybody. We can't really get into Indian astrology. We can't really get into Chinese astrology, Aztec, Mayan, First Nations, Indigenous. Like, it's just so unbelievably vast. So we're going to basically hone in on 3. So let's start with Egypt. Now, as you said, like, we know that the stars were important to Egypt, but from what you've read, just how important were they?
Fundamental, actually. So now this is one thing you have to kind of note about a lot of these different cultures, with maybe the exception of the Babylonians, but the Egyptians and the Greeks definitely reflected this. They have myths that are contradictory. And so the myth that I kind of ascribe to when I do my parents' readings for my clients is basically that the sun god dies every night. And when he dies, he's traveling through the womb of his mother Nut, who is the night sky, and he has to go through various different trials to then be reborn the next day. Right. And those trials are determined by the heliacal rising star. Heliacal rise, and I know that we actually exchanged a book so that we could both be on the same page. Not defined well in there. So what it means is that it's the star directly rising before the sun. It's not every star heliacally rises. Only one. It's very specific. Sometimes there'll be multiple that cross the horizon simultaneously, but it's very rare. So if you get like a parents reading at some point, everyone has at least one heliacal star. Some people, and this is very rare, will have 3 or 4. Very, very rare. Does not happen very often. Sometimes you'll see 2. Most of the time, one heliacal star. So the Egyptians made a calendar around the heliacal star because it ruled about a 10-day time period for them. This is how they constructed their calendar. And this star was very significant to them because they decided the circumpolar stars, not those guys. Those guys are the immortals. They don't care about you. Basically, they don't give a shit about humans.
Right.
And the reason why is because they never touch the horizon. Yeah. So that's why when they say like, oh, the pyramids of Giza was pointing up at Thuban, maybe, but they weren't really keen on the immortals because the immortals weren't very kind to them. What they believed is that when a star touched the horizon, like a heliacal star, or a star in any phase for that matter that touched the horizon, that god would then walk amongst us. And they actually had a myth around how the first god that walked amongst us, when his foot touched the earth, the heel became wounded from a lack of divinity, which is very interesting when you think about Achilles, right? And the thing is, they were gods, so they would proudly march on to try to understand what it meant to be human. And now they were open to our prayers and petitions because they cared. And then when that star would begin to rise and culminate, it would go up into the circumpolar region and petition on our behalf with the immortals to get them kind of be nicer to us. And then when it would set on the other side, it would bring back a gift from the immortals, give it to us, and then voluntarily die, go into the underworld, petition with the underworld gods, the ancestors, the land spirits, and then be reborn the next year. So they had this whole calendar around it called the decans. And eventually the Greeks did change that. So at first the decans or the decans were set for the heliacal rise, then the heliacal culmination. Then the Greeks kind of take over and imperialize as they do. And they were like, precession's a bitch. How about we just change this to something that's fixed?
Right.
For at least listeners who are not like super up on what precession or any of this even means, precession is the tilt of the earth. It is constantly wobbling, and over time, it changes our perspective of the sky by 1 degree every 72 years. Now, the Neo-Babylonians, that wasn't a huge deal because they were only around for like 300 years. But the Egyptians were around for 30 centuries. So they were constantly updating their calendars. Now, they didn't think that was a big deal because they were actually pretty animistic. And they're like, yeah, our gods are living. Just update the calendar.
Right.
But the Greeks come along and the Greeks are like, no. The highest form of divinity is fixed, predictable, and symmetrical, and that cannot be it. So they took a lot of concepts and changed them into something that was more terrestrial in nature, believe it or not, way less about what was actually in the sky.
Yeah.
That's my little soapbox there. That's why the Egyptians were like, this is important, stars.
The studying the Egyptians is my jam. I absolutely love them. And maybe we can touch on this a little bit, but if people are interested, if you ever take a look at, and again, it's very speculative, but the work of Robert Bauval and to some extent, John Anthony West, the entire site of Saqqara is one giant complex built in and around this cycle that Amaya was talking about. The entrance to the temple has 14 false entrances. One of them is the right entrance. There's 36 columns of pairs of pillars to represent the 36 decans. The step pyramid itself, built by an architect by the name of Imhotep. You can just go so vastly deep into this, and truthfully, to say otherwise, you're missing the point. The stars were so unbelievably important to the Egyptians that it's just mind-blowing. To speak on something that you brought up earlier, why Sirius? Why was Sopdet? Sopdet is the name of Sirius itself for the Egyptians, but why Sirius?
So actually there's a few constellations in the same area that all kind of go together. So we call it Orion today, but to the Egyptians that was Pharaoh, and Pharaoh was an emanation of God. You also had the constellation of Gemini, which contains the first foot that ever touched Earth. That's Alhina. So Alhina is the proud, wounded heel that marches on. And so what they believed is that Sirius hailed the rebirth of Pharaoh. And so they wanted to know when exactly it was going to rise or culminate. It changed over time, but it started off at the rise because they believed that Sirius led the souls of the pharaohs to be reincarnated because it was an emanation of God. This was just one continued God with many different faces and phases, you could say. And so Sirius was the guide through the underworld to reintroduce that pharaoh back into the world at some point. So very, very, very important. Plus, on top of it, Sirius, the culmination of it, actually heralded the flooding of the Nile. Now, to most ancient cultures, things like rivers, actually any body of water that was considered like slightly deep, was a portal to the underworld or the other world. Because, well, it was scary and you could drown. And where did you go? I always imagine what it'd be like to be on the Nile. It was life-giving and very important. The flooding of the Nile was a huge event because it refertilized the land, but it took out people and buildings and animals and agriculture. But I also think about like all the other stars that they kind of gave significations to, like Deneb Adij, which is the shamanic swan star. Right. And I always think about why they called it shamanic. And here's why. Imagine you're in the Nile, you're doing your laundry with your group of friends, and a pike that's 30 feet long just takes you out and you disappear, right? Yeah. Well, they'd watch these swans, these gorgeous birds, land from some other world. You know, they weren't native to Egypt. They were usually migrating, land in the Nile. And what most people don't know about swans is like they can snap your finger off easily just by biting you. And they can give you a concussion or snap your neck with their wings. They're very fierce. Yeah. Well, the Egyptians figured that out really fast when they tried to, like, you know, eat them. And the thing is, they could land in this river where there were alligators and pikes and hippopotamuses and hold their own. And they could dive under to get food and they could rise back up again. And then they would fly off at some point to some place completely unknown to them. Yeah. And so the Nile was kind of both life-giving and scary as hell. And for them to know when it flooded was very important because this was when the souls were kind of like released. Yeah. They wanted to know when that was going to happen. So you didn't just have Sirius. You had Procyon, which to them was both the first announcer star, the first dog star, and Canis Minor. The Greeks and a few other different traditions in that area, that's like the witching star because of the immediacy of it. So Procyon would be the first announcement of like, hey, Sirius is on the way. Then you had Merzim, which was literally called the announcer star, and it's in Canis Major right next to Sirius. It rises first, and it gives you about a 10-day heads up for like everyone to clear away from the Nile. Right. You don't want to be taken out. Do you want the souls of the underworld to drag you down, right? Awesome. So it merged him, and then Sirius would eventually rise and then culminate. And that's when the full flood would happen. So it was a very important event to them. And of course, anything having to do with death, rebirth, and transformation ends up being huge for them. You know, you even have like Acab. I'm trying to remember the exact name. All of it's transliterated. It's in the constellation of Cancer. And this was the sacred scarab beetle. They actually have myths around like this beetle that actually rolls the earth, basically, like it does a piece of dung. And the reason why you're thinking like, why would they think that this is so sacred? Well, anything that could turn excrement into fertile soil and look like a resplendent jewel, yeah, big moment. Plus Cancer, which has always been a very faint constellation. They consider this to be and the Greeks end up syncretizing this, the portal of the souls re-entering the world to be reborn. Right. And so the beetle or this specific star was considered to help those souls find bodies. So you have a bunch of them in this kind of area that are all occurring, but Sirius was super bright. They actually called it the Scorcher.
Right.
because when there was no light pollution, they believed you could get starburned like you could get sunburned. That's how bright it was. And if I were to pull up my software and show you the magnitude of Sirius compared to our sun, it's actually brighter. So it's just at night and it's far away. So, like, we don't see it that way. But you
No.
can imagine about 3,000 years ago, it was extremely bright, and so bright that they were like, hey, put on sunblock or wear a hat. You're going to get starburn tonight.
Right.
One of the things I do want to clarify is, like, a lot of people think that all these buildings were pointing up at stars, but actually in the last like 20 years, the most amazing thing was discovered.
Mm.
Underneath most of these buildings are mechanisms to move them.
Right.
And so why were they moving them? Well, if we know that they're not really into circumpolar stars, they're not really trying to point up at them, right? What they wanted to do is make sure the buildings faced a specific direction. And that would change because of precession and the rotation of the stars in the sky. And so why? Because those giant statues in the front of their buildings became houses for the gods that walked amongst us, which was the first ever real astrological talisman as we'd consider it today.
Right.
So this is pretty wild when you think about this. A lot of technology, they came up with the first way to tell time at night, utilizing this idea of the sun moving through different stations of the stars every night to be reborn. The decans was the first, like, very, you could say, formulated calendar. Very, very strict, had a lot of religious activities, would tell you who to worship, what magic to do, who you need to pray to, because that God was going to be open to hearing your prayers and petitions, and therefore could probably bring the sun back the next morning. Kind of important if you want to exist.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of cool things the Egyptians did in particular, and that's actually, I read an Egyptian style parents reading because
Cool.
that really resonates for me, and it reconnects us back with the sky, because the Babylonians got away from that. And we should probably talk about the Babylonians next, huh?
I think so. So let's get into it. The Babylonians. Now, of the three that we're going to talk about, the Babylonians are the ones that they throw me for a bit of a loop. They're strange. They have the Sumerian influence. Now, Carl Sagan once said that if ancient aliens actually talked to human beings or a culture on Earth, it would have been the Sumerians. But the Babylonians, what's up with these guys? Did they just write everything down? Because that's kind of what we know from archaeological evidence of how enamored they were with astrology. That they were really good at making note of things. So what's up with them Babylonians?
So the Babylonians, as all cultures, were a result of all the cultures before them. So there was a lot of things that happened previous to them from the Sumerians and Assyrians, and even trying to remember which culture it was. There's a few different ones in that area. They had already, and this is what I tell my clients when we get into sessions, there had already been worship of circumpolar stars for several hundred years at that point. I call it the period of savior ass astrology, because if you were a star priest and you got something wrong, you were being publicly executed.
Right.
So when you see these kind of crazy prognostications where it was like, that's physically impossible, I kind of put myself into their shoes, and I'm like, I'd be like, what if the gods want to fuck with me? I'm just going to write it down. Just write it down, right? But the Babylonians became really serious about it because they created this cosmology that basically said that Marduk, which was in like the mid-heaven, which is what they called the middle heaven. Today we call the mid-heaven the basically the zenith of the sky.
Right.
But it was considered for the Babylonians kind of this in-between place that Marduk kind of ordered the planets around, because what the Babylonians did, especially during the Neo-Babylonian period, was amazing.
Okay.
They had been doing the circumpolar star thing with everybody else, and they had specific things that were ordered to this. Actually, 3 different qualifications of stars, one that was across the ecliptic, 2 that were in different places. But they were the first culture to discover that the wandering stars, which is what they called the planets, because they did not know they were planets,
Right.
and the luminaries, which is the sun and the moon, they discovered that the wandering stars were not just randomly wandering. They figured out that they were following the pathway of the sun, which is when you see this huge shift in this area from being a very kind of lunar, stellar kind of culture in the general Mesopotamian area. They were the first one to go like full hardcore solar. Marduk is a solar god. And so, and that's because they're like, look, all these planets are following the sun, right? On top of it, they were the first ones to figure out the initial math for knowing when the planets would be in a certain sign or place in the past, present, and future. They realized that they actually had patterns. It wasn't that random. And so they kind of started focusing hardcore on the planet. They started moving more and more away from the stars as we go further into the Babylonian period, especially Neo-Babylonian period. But before that, Marduk was ordering everything around, and there was these 3 different realms of stars, and the planets would wander through the central column of stars that was following the pathway of the sun, which is what we call the ecliptic. And so they believe that Marduk was kind of like this grand chess player trying to transfer messages to us here on Earth. This eventually gets syncretized by the Greeks, and what they talk about is that the planets are like the translators of light for the stars, which does give a very clean explanation for what the Babylonians were essentially doing. But they had these crazy religious rites around it. Mm-hmm. They had very specific stars that were really important to them, usually very high magnitude stars. I always kind of find it funny because they syncretized a lot of other cultures. If you really go deep into it, a lot of their myths end up being this reflection of like, oh, there's a little bit of this culture, a little bit of that culture. Right. Like you find like the information around Mithras, right? Yeah. Well, Mithraism existed before Mithras, as we know it in the Roman period, because it was definitely called by other names. And you see this reflected all the way back in like Neo-Babylonian period, just woven in and out, eventually becomes its own thing. And so the Babylonians had a very complex cosmology between figuring out, hey, the planets are not just these crazy stars that are just going wild across the sky. They actually have apparent motion. We can measure it. We can predict it. And then they had their 3 different qualifications of stars, different kind of categories, broken into constellations. They probably, now this is contestable, but the zodiac that we know today is very close to what the Babylonians were using at that time. Previous to that, they did start with what looks like 6 huge constellations across the ecliptic. It eventually gets changed to 12 so that you can see the trials of Gilgamesh, essentially, because he had 12 trials, which then becomes the 12 trials of Hercules. It's fun because that's the thing about this. It's not clean in the Mesopotamian area. You cannot say, oh, this is purely Babylonian, this is purely Sumerian, or even purely Egyptian. They were all just kind of taking from each other and reflecting it. It was a melting pot. And
chaos
they weren't
magic.
Clear about it. 100% chaos.
If it's useful, take it.
I would even argue that the magic of late antiquity is kind of the predecessor of chaos magic, right? You look at the PGM, and they have every god under the sun in this book. Same principles, though, right?
Very much so.
So they did the same with their stars and their sky. It was very much like, oh, well, that reflects this in Egypt, and this reflects what happened in Sumeria previously, and Assyria here. And even you have the Persian crossover. We don't even really fully know to what extent the Persians were really taking from the Western, because we haven't translated most of those texts. So they could have had a very rich tradition outside of us.
Yeah, it's craziness. Yeah, I love it. Now, just a quick little segue here. They said that perhaps there was something that predated the Babylonian zodiac. It's called the Armenian zodiac. And they say that it predated the 12 by 2,000 years. What's your opinion on that?
It's very possible, actually. Yeah. I don't rule it out at all because, well, look at the Neolithic art that we've started to track, like, oh, they had already identified the constellation of Taurus as far back as maybe the Neolithic, maybe even the Paleolithic era. Well, why wouldn't it be possible that the Armenian zodiac existed too? It's kind of silly that we kind of joke that a group of astrologers is called an argument. And I think that most astrologers want to be considered, scientists, because we do track the sky so closely. And I understand that kind of desire for legitimacy and not being considered fringe.
Right.
But also, like, we don't have a clean understanding of it either. We just have I would say, a deeper understanding, because we're going beyond just, oh, look at this artifact we found. Well, let's not make any assumptions. It was just a bone, right? We go, no, we can make some pretty healthy deductions here. And let's actually try it. Why just leave it at, oh, this artifact probably was used for moon whatever, right? Why not go and recreate it and see if it tracks? If it does, it's very likely they were using it for that. So I don't doubt that there probably has been many different versions of a zodiac across many different cultures going far back in time, because we've been using it both as a tool to communicate with the gods and as a tool to help us understand when to plant our crops and do our rituals and best times to move on and get away from a place. It's been happening for thousands of years. Why wouldn't we have many zodiacs dating back in time?
Yeah, I hear you. The Babylonians also had these things that were basically, they were star catalogs. There's one, I believe it's called Mul Apin.
Mhm.
MUL.APIN. Why are these important to at least know for how the Babylonians documented the stars themselves?
Oh my gosh, they're probably some of the most complete star catalogs that were ever created.
Yeah.
I mean, we can still draw from them today with relative accuracy. And it had everything to do with like everything from rituals, cultural events, even like being told what job you were going to get. If especially if you're in an upper part of society, you would get your chart read and they'd be like, "Oh, this is your destiny. We're placing you here." The Chinese, they definitely have the most complete star catalog that we know of dating back thousands of years, but it is for the southern hemisphere primarily. So definitely a little different. For us today, we can go to the Mulapin and we can trace back like the names of stars that obviously have been changed over time. Nowadays, a lot of the names are either transliterated Arabic or Greek.
Right.
Very few of them retain their original names. And that helps us too to understand, like, from the perspective of their cosmology and their gods, what was important because naming something to the ancients and most of those ancient cultures was considered an act of creation or acknowledgement, one or the other.
Yeah.
And so to name something, to put something down in words, to record it, to make an image, that was magic, but it wasn't considered a big deal. Just like you have, I'm going to probably pronounce this incorrectly, you're an Egyptologist, but Heka or Hika from the
Hecka.
Egyptians, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't this profound big act. You lived your life in Heka. Like Heka was happening around you all the time
All the
to
time.
sing, to talk. Yeah. It wasn't this thing. So like you were living magic. And so magic wasn't a big deal. It was what everybody was doing. Well, definitely the same for the Babylonians.
Okay.
And their star maps really determined when and where they would do things. And they really helped out. Like they basically gave this huge leg up to the Greeks who kind of superimposed a lot of their own philosophy, which was pretty cool stuff. On top of it, renamed things. You know, the Babylonians did not have a fixed zodiac. They had the moving zodiac, just like the Egyptians had their moving stars.
Mhm.
The Greeks made their zodiac based off of seasonal sunlight. That's why I don't want to ever hear the argument that Ophiuchus is the 13th sign. Kill me,
Okay.
please. Like,
But I
that's
read
not what's
it. I
happening.
read it somewhere. Somebody was trying to discredit astrology and they brought up the 13th sign. What? What?
Okay, so let's, for anyone who wants a good argument for this, the zodiac was never based off of the stars for the Greeks.
Yeah.
It was based off of seasonal sunlight. That's why if you look at the Thema Mundi, which is the birth chart of the world, Cancer is the rising sign.
Oh,
And that's because we have the summer solstice in Cancer.
yeah.
And the stars roughly lined up with these signs, but they knew that they were going to move. They'd seen it happen to the Egyptians, and they basically their kind of way of getting around it was they said there were different spheres of divinity. The highest form was unity. It's where we come from, where we return to. And right underneath it was the fixed stars, because even though they move very slowly.
Right.
And they said the fixed stars lent their images to the zodiac. Now, if you get into the anthropology, what we would call astrological magic is scholastic image magic.
Hmm.
And the reason why is because you're putting an image on something, consecrating it underneath the specific timing period to basically draw in the light of a star or a planet at its optimal position.
Right.
And what you're doing is you're basically embodying it into this object, right? Well, they were basically saying that the zodiac or these little talismanic houses doesn't matter if they move away from the stars because they're conceptual and they're based off of observable phenomena here on Earth.
Right.
And that's where people get it wrong. They think that it's about what's in the sky, but you see this huge rift start to happen in late Babylonia where they stopped really caring that much about what was happening literally in the sky and started using their ability to measure and calculate things to make prognostications. And this gets transferred to the Greeks later on, who basically look at what the Egyptians have done and how they have to constantly update everything. And they're like, not that. We don't want a living sky. We want something that is like a pillar, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so the fixed star is pretty high form of divinity, not the highest. Still, they gave their powers and abilities to the zodiac. And that way, the zodiac cannot be aligned with anything at all
Mhm.
and still exist and still give us pretty good indications of timing as both a calendar and a, kind of religious magical device. Very good for sympathetic magic. They really superimposed like natural philosophy into this and Neoplatonism.
Right.
Not great if you want to go out into the night sky and find a star, which is where my existential crisis happened because I went to go find a star I have a conjunction with. And what the Greeks do is they take a star, which can be anywhere in the sky, and they project it back onto the ecliptic, which is the pathway of the sun. So for me, that was Vega, the lyre of Orpheus. And it's actually like kind of very close to like in the middle of the ecliptic, like where you'd see in 3D space. It's kind of like sitting in the middle right here. It's eventually going to become our pole star.
Cool.
And I thought that it was like at 15 degrees Capricorn. It's not. It's nowhere close to it. In fact, the Milky Way separates Capricorn as we know it astrologically from Vega.
Right.
And that's a huge rift. And I was like, what's happening? I thought this was all supposed to be observable. No. Observable phenomena on Earth. Observable geometric relationships between the planets along the ecliptic. That's it. The rest of it, not observable. And that's why I got into doing like Egyptian star parents, because like I can actually go out and see these things. And as an animist, that's very important for me because I want to have that honest relationship with whatever I am actually working with. So the differences between them, the Babylonians start off really observational, super into the stars. It kind of shifts away over time to being much more planetary. Eventually, you don't even have to really look at the sky.
Right.
The Egyptians kept doing what they were doing, which is heliacal stars, and then you have parens. You have this question in our notes, so I'll answer it.
Please
What
do.
is a paren?
Please, what is a paren?
To give you the technical word, which I'm not going to pronounce correctly. Guys, I'm Midwestern. I don't pronounce anything correctly. Just get over it. It's parentalanta. And basically what this is it is a star in its actual position in the sky in an angular relationship, three-dimensional angular relationship with a planet, which can also be in a phase. Planets rise, culminate, and set throughout the day. They can be down on the nadir as well. So either 90, 180, or 0 degrees in a three-dimensional relationship. This is very confusing for a lot of modern astrologers. The astrology we're practicing now, whether it's modern or Hellenistic, it is not based off of what's observable in the sky. It is based off of this concept. And so if you're looking for a star and you're expecting it to be, again, at like 15 degrees Capricorn, most stars are not on the ecliptic. So it's going to be confusing. And they're out in the other parts of space that we have not looked at for a very long time as a practice. So the Egyptians would have these very precise parens, which were determined by minutes rather than degrees. Otherwise, the whole sky would be in your chart.
Right.
And that gets crazy because in a normal astrology chart, what we'd read like Hellenistically would be like anywhere between 0 and 13 degrees, depending on the planet for an aspect or a relationship. Nope, not with parens. Parens are literally like 1 or 2 minutes. You can see it in the sky using your fingers. And that's wild because it's very precise.
Very, yeah. That's shocking. Minutes.
And it's like, how'd they come up with this? I'm always amazed. We think that ancient civilizations were just so stupid or superstitious. But look at this. This is just astounding.
Yeah.
Astounding.
Love it. Now, let's talk a bit about them Greeks. You definitely touched on them, but I really want to hone in on here. So the Greeks are where most of the names that we have for the stars in the constellation, they come from the Greeks. How important was astrology or the stars themselves, truthfully, the stars themselves to the earlier Greeks, but also, I'm going to throw this curveball in here because we could probably do a full episode on it, but to the Hellenistic Greeks.
So the Hellenistic Greeks really became much more focused on the planets than the stars.
Okay.
You do find that Ptolemy wrote a whole book on star phases based off of what was basically cultural knowledge at that point because of the Egyptians. It reads like gobbledygook if you don't know what you're looking at. Right. It really does. Because they kind of assumed you would know more than you would. Because it was common to them. They did not use it in their astrology, but they did have specific stars, the Bohemian stars, that start to really emerge, especially in their magical traditions. And this is like a very carefully selected set of stars that kind of developed over time. They really come into position, honestly, after the Greeks. You start to see them really become prominent around the medieval Renaissance periods because they're starting to get into like, more of a Christianized magic in a sense, wanting to make it very structured. You see like the beginnings of something a little bit more ceremonial. But yeah, they weren't as obsessed with the stars as say like the Egyptians or even the earlier Babylonians. They really kind of looked at what the Babylonians were doing and how they were getting some pretty accurate readings on earthly events, which is what they were kind of obsessed with. They're like, the gods are trying to show us what happens here on Earth. And so they were really particular about the planets, and that's why they created their own zodiac that was based off of that seasonal sunlight. They became really solar over time. It didn't start off that way. Actually, you find that like as time goes on and we move more towards the Roman period, the moon, for example, was originally given the designation of messenger because it is the fastest moving body in the sky. It gets through a sign in 2.5 days. Well, that gets eventually changed to Mercury, right? They started dumbing down certain planets, which is interesting. Like Venus would be Isis or Ishtar.
Yeah.
Eventually gets turned into Aphrodite, which is definitely not the same.
Nope.
So things kind of change, but they do have an obsession with the planets in particular. And they even take a lot of concepts like our idea of the ascendant, midheaven, descendant, nadir was really the Egyptian heliacal rise, culmination, setting, Hearthstone area. And the houses were really kind of based off of this idea that the Egyptians had these different kind of, you could say, stations for the sun at night, trying to get through them, live through the trials, be reborn the next day. So they did take a lot from these other cultures, but one thing that they didn't take as much from is really the stars, because they were kind of like, well, the planets give us direction for here on Earth, but the stars, it's this weird kind of liminal space to them where they move slowly enough to be a higher form of divinity, but too fast to be considered the highest form of divinity. So if they're that slow, the only time they'd get really kind of excited is specifically like stars that were on the ecliptic or very close or very high magnitude. They would then track, okay, that's heliacally rising. They knew what a heliacal rise was. And they would kind of be like, oh, this is the downfall of an empire, for example. We just had like a major conjunction with Altair as an example of that. Altair is the battle eagle. That's a projected conjunction.
Okay.
And that was Jupiter and Saturn, both conjoined Altair. The way I talk about it in my practice is like, it's kind of like that end scene in The Highlander where he's basically like, hey, we're probably all going to die, but at least we fought for our land, right? And everyone's like, yeah! And you're like, did these people hear anything this man just said? Like, why are you so excited? But that's kind of what Altair represents. And we're kind of seeing like this attitude that's starting to pervade, especially I see it on social media, of like, just burn the whole thing to the ground. And that's very Altair to be optimistic about that, as if that's a good thing. Right. So they would say that that's a major prognostication. That's a moment in time. Plus that conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn would be considered the changing of empires, or the end of one and the beginning of another, the changing of dynasties.
Interesting.
So, but you add the star in and it's like triply more important. If we also had an eclipse at the same time, they'd probably think the end of the world was happening. Right. They'd be like, look at all this happening. That's it. We're all going to die. So they only really use specific stars. It became more and more refined as we move forward in time into later antiquity, mostly because the planets were more immediate. And they started forming entire philosophies. Like we have the sister sciences emerge from here. You have astronomy, astrology, which astrology was the first, then astronomy emerges from it, in case there was any...
Shh, don't tell him. Don't tell anybody.
Their brains might explode. Yeah. But you also get magic was considered one, and then you had alchemy, and they were all separate, but they were all sister sciences you're supposed to learn together. So if you get the timing right, then your alchemy would be better. Your magic would be better. If you could do magic with your astrology, you'd be closer to the planets, and theurgy would be something that transformed you in an alchemical way without it being alchemy. Like they had this very intertwined thing going on. It was very rare for someone to actually know all three, but if you did, you were like masterful. Usually you'd like specialize.
A wizard.
The wizard. That's You're right. Merlin, basically. Perfect. So
was it the Hellenistic Greeks that took the Egyptian decans and actually put them into the zodiac?
They definitely took what the decans were and they changed it into something completely different. A great book, hopefully, knock on wood, that will get reprinted this year, is 36 Faces by Austin Coppock, because he did a massive amount of research on all of this. Now, the rest of the book is kind of his personal take on the decans, which he is incredibly inspired, and I have seen it play out very accurately. If you get into astrological magic, those of us who do decan magic are like, wow, that's where the juice is. Yeah. Like, that is the thing. But as far as keeping it with the stars, that's no longer what's happened. They are fixed now. Right. So now it's fixed onto the zodiac because they did believe that the decans were important, but they're kind of lost in time as to why. I have a theory about that.
Okay.
So if you look especially at like the PGM, what you often have to do is kind of put on a face, so to speak, of a god. So you'll invoke a god that is kind of your patron deity, put on that face, and then compel another entity.
Yes.
Well, decan literally translates to face. And so my belief is what you're doing when you do decanic magic or you're working with the decans in your chart is it actually gives you a very powerful face in a sense. You kind of embody it.
Right.
When I started getting into the decans personally, I had a few things happening in my life that were weird
Yep.
that I couldn't explain. I grew up in an evangelical family, which is so funny. I'm the biggest disappointment ever. It's great. And
welcome to the club.
yeah, we're all a bunch of misfits here, but we're happy misfits.
Yes.
I wasn't really allowed to look at other religions.
Okay.
So when I suddenly got this urge to start a rosary practice, because to the evangelicals, Catholicism is a form of witchcraft, which they're not wrong. It is. It's folk magic.
I just did an episode on it.
Yeah, you did a great episode on it. I didn't know anything about Catholicism. I thought at one point I wanted to be a nun because I realized I didn't want to be ordained as an evangelical. I got deep into the theology and was like, there's not much here, is there?
Right.
So I never really went further than that, though. I became an atheist after that for a while. And so when I suddenly got this urge to I need to go and start this rosary practice. I'm like, I know nothing about Mary, like in that sense. It's not really taught in my background. So I started learning about Mary and I was like, that's not doing it for me either. Well, my Jupiter is in the decan of the prayer beads, Jupiter having to do with faith. And it's conjoined by projection, fixed star Algol. So yeah, Mary's probably not going to be my bag. Algol is definitely not that. That's the head of Medusa.
Right.
Not so much. Well, it's in a perfect sextile to my moon, which is in the decan of what Austin would call Hecate. And so I went on this desperate search looking for Jack Grail's book, The Hecatean, because he's the first person who's ever really done a very formal, almost Catholic-inspired practice of making a rosary to Hecate. That's a wild story, but I did eventually get the book, and I did start that practice, and it's been a very nourishing practice in my magic and my spirituality, and that's because I look at it and I go, oh yeah, that's literal. I had my moon in the 9th house of directly communicating with the gods in the decan of Hecate on the fixed star Procyon, the witching star, in a perfect sextile to Jupiter, the planet of faith and religion, conjoined Algol, who's like, yeah, we are not going to do Mary, I can tell you that much. But we are in the decan of the prayer beads, so we need to find something.
Right.
And they're in this relationship that says this will feel best for you. The moon would be what nurtures you, Jupiter being faith, that 9th house being bigger picture and communication. 7th house being a very direct relationship. So that was so literal. And I wouldn't have been able to figure out that impulse without looking closer at those decans. And it was so, so literal. And every single one of my decans, I have a planet in. I'm like, how? So I do recommend it, even though it's no longer synced with the stars. His book on the decans, first of all, it gives you immense amounts of history that he had to pick apart because it's not readily available. You have to really look for it. It really helped me connect the dots regarding, I was learning about the PGM and I had this star practice and I'm like, something's here, I can't find it. And it was the face. So when the Egyptians were like, oh, this is the face of the god right now, they're like, this is the one we pray to today. And in 10 days, it will change. Right. And we need to make sure that our sun god is reborn. So let's make sure we get the face correctly. So you would dress differently and maybe put on that face that god to worship that god. That Heka was very, very performative. I'm in a class right now with Reverend Zemi. Okay. I'm not going to say his full name. I have no idea how to say it. But he just got done writing the book, Speak Thoth. Right. I think it's called The Book of Flesh and Feather. And he's talking about how Heka is wonderful because it doesn't have to be this crazy thing. You could be like, I just love writing poetry, so why not write poetry to your patron deity? Or he even asserts your very, very bad joke about fart jokes. Actually, the Egyptians wrote a ton of jokes.
They did.
He went and learned Coptic Egyptian just to figure out how this all works, so he wasn't depending on other people's translations. And he was delighted to find a bunch of really bad dad jokes. And his favorite thing is well, yeah, Jehudi, or Thoth as we would call him, is actually a trickster god. And of course he would love a play on words and joking and having fun. Why not? Right.
I've said it before and many, many times. The absolute key to magic is dad jokes. And nobody can argue with me with that. People don't know this when they start out in magic, but you have to know dad jokes to get good at magic. I'm just going to say that. Um,
I think delight is actually a key part of magic. A lot of people get really, really, stuck on the seriousness. And yeah, there's moments where it's serious, but like delight and joy and being close to your deities in a way that is playful, I think makes it that much more, I guess, accessible. If we get too serious about it, we won't do it. And that's
exactly.
especially true for the stars.
Hmm.
I took that concept. I'm actually writing a whole thing. It'll probably end up being a book 'cause it's now over 20,000 words long.
That's a book.
But my idea is that when you look at these different cultures talking about stars, I believe that's just that entity showing a different face of itself
Okay.
that culture can kind of handle. I kind of take that verse from the Bible. It talks about how if you were to see God in his totality, the meat would like melt off of your bones.
Slaw off your bones. Yes.
But you see that in so many different like ancient religions especially. And I think to myself, well, yeah, that if you see it reflected in multiple places, I tend to think that it's got some bearing of truth to it. And then when I see these sometimes overlapping different myths about the stars from different places and times, I'm like, that's a different face. And we're seeing multiple facets. Like Algol is considered quite evil by the Greeks and the Persians. And even the Chinese, they're like, oh yeah, the burial mound. But then you get to the Mayans, and they loved this binary star. They thought it was part of Xibalba, and they venerated it. And Xibalba was their underworld, but underworld was not a bad thing.
No.
They thought the underworld was a great thing. And so like it changes everything. One key thing is definitely a lot of like maybe necromantic tendencies, a lot of your dead or ancestors or unwell spirits that you might need to tend to, which has been my life story. But on the other hand, there's a primordial creatrix in there too, because she was a snake goddess. And so like we start getting these different faces, and it's like she's so much more dimensional than just, oh, the most evil star in the sky. And if you get into this magically, the best thing you could do is actually open yourself up to multiple versions of a story. I just bought a 300-page book on all of the myths associated with the Pleiades around the world.
Amazing.
Just the Pleiades. I wish they had them for every single star because it's so hard to find this information.
Right.
But it has changed the way that I work with Alcyone, which is the brightest star in the Pleiades, in that cluster, in that nebula. And has given me some really cool insights too. Like, oh, what if we experimented and tried this instead? Because like Agrippa was one dude, probably multiple dudes, but one small set of dudes.
17 people that gathered all of the data for Agrippa to write his book.
Why would you limit yourself to that? 17 out of millions of people.
Yeah.
I think it's a great base. Learn the principles, understand the principles, and now go out and play. Your magic should be pushing the envelope, right? Why are we stuck on just the Picatrix and Agrippa or a few of these old dead dudes' books? They had a relationship with the stars. You can too. That's my whole kind of like shtick is like, get out there, be in relationship, learn more. Because there's so much to them beyond just, oh, well, Alcyone will give you blindness, which is what they said anciently. Like, of course, because the seven sisters were beautiful and they would incite lust and then you'd go blind, right?
Right. Amazing. Thank you. That is a lot to take apart. I'm going to have to re-listen to that a couple of times, Amaya. That's great. Just to touch on this a little bit further, but why do you think that different cultures have such similar meanings in the stars and the planets? Mars always seems to be about war or martial across different cultures. You have the Pleiades. They're always associated with groups of women. Orion with hunters. Mercury with gods of wisdom and writing. What are these? Is this coming from some one mythology in like a Graham Hancock kind of way? Or do you think that there might be something in the stars themselves?
Well, as an animist, I would argue that that's because these people start getting in relationships with these stars, and these stars and these planets, well, they are what they are. Like, you see some differences, like I said, but there's also like a thread running through most of them.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that says like these are living. Right. It's not that simple. It's not that compressed. And why wouldn't they have a relationship with each different culture? And it would be unique, right? I kind of tell this to my clients when we're having our talks about how they can start star veneration. And I tell them, this is my relationship to them, but kind of think about it like if we had a mutual friend. We would know that mutual friend, but our relationship would be unique to that mutual friend. And so while we have a basic understanding where we can all three meet in the middle, kind of like a weird, I guess, Venn diagram, there's still individual tendencies there that are going to be unique to just you and that person and me and that person. And I think that that's true of non-human being persons as well, is that they do tend to show up pretty consistently, but then they have little quirks and little changes That would be my argument, but it's a very non-anthropological, non-historical argument. So there
Right.
you go.
There's a wonderful book called The Origin of the World's Mythologies by E.J. Michael Witzel. And he talks about how when the Earth was one more larger landmass, part of it was Gondwana, the other part was Laurasia. But they go through how that a lot of these mythologies probably came from similar sources. It wasn't just one thing together, but that specifically with Gondwana, you have the universe has always just existed, it is what it is, and then that's just how it goes. Laurasian is more when you get stories of floods starting to happen within mythology, to stories of seasonal changes becoming like spirits almost, and then pre-Gaian, where you get things like gods entering into the mix. So I think that it doesn't have to be one thing. I think that a lot of these things, perhaps the stars are telling us things. Perhaps also that it gets involved in the mythology. It doesn't have to be an either or situation. I don't know what maybe you'd say about that, but I don't think it has to be one thing.
I don't either. And I think this is kind of the issue with being in a very modern westernized world is we want a very clear, concise answer.
Yeah.
But I'm okay with ambiguity. That's kind of part of what makes magic amazing is I couldn't scientifically explain why this happened. I can replicate it if I'm a good magician. Right? Because I've got a kind of like a system in a sense of like, this is kind of how it worked for me and it's working consistently. So I'm going to keep doing it. But could I explain it materially? Probably not.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think that, as Pete Carroll has said, that magic works in practice, not in theory. And to speak a little bit more on working in practice, how does one start being an astromage, perhaps, with a penchant for the past ways? Like if you're interested in how ancient cultures saw stars, how do you bring that into a magic of now?
So I would suggest before you start doing magic, get into relationship because they're not the same. Magic is obviously us trying to assert our will upon the world around us, and hopefully with the aid of entities that are non-human that can kind of power it up. Unless you don't believe that, then you think it's all internal and you're just trying to like power up your own will. Yeah. So as an animist, though, I'd argue it's definitely the relationships around us. And when I switched to that framework, my magic became a lot more consistent and powerful. So that's my little soapbox I'll get off of. But with the stars, I would start by getting into a relationship with the stars. Now, to the Greeks, I mentioned this earlier, they believed that the planets act as translators of light because the stars are very far away from us. So the easiest way to start is there's actually a list. Now, just a warning, if you go look this list up, do not go and look at the prognostications. Okay. You will not be happy about it. It's a lot of, there's a specific astrologer named Eberton that was kind of like obsessed with doom events, and they use a lot of that material.
I see.
But you can look up the list of stars on like Astrology King, like their projected degrees. And what you want to do is you want the moon to be at that projected degree to be that translator of light. I would suggest the moon first because the moon is the closest body to us. If you want to get really complicated, you could go with moon phase as well, but that does lower down your options pretty rapidly. Now, in my experience of celestial theurgy or relationship building, it's better to just stick with one or two that you know you can commit to than to try to do like a bunch of them. Because what I find is this relationship building, it works best when you are very consistent. Now, I would say one or two stars is good to start. So you could go and look up like by projected degree, where do I have the conjunctions in my chart? All of us have some. Mm-hmm. That's a good way to start because it's already in your chart. You can kind of say like you're a child of that star in a sense. Yeah. And so it may be a little bit easier to connect. Or if you feel extremely drawn to a specific star, go for it. I do suggest that unless you have a very robust magical practice, to stay away from extreme stars when you're first starting because it can be a bit much. Like I have a practice with algal, but I went into that very slowly because there can be side effects to what we call attunement. And I was very lucky because it's basically everywhere in my chart by parents and conjunctions. So I didn't think that I had much of that, but not everyone will experience it that way. So I suggest to everyone, like, go slow and go with more positive stars. Wait until that moon is conjoined to that degree. If you want to get fancy, you probably want it to be like waxing or full moon if you can, because it'll amplify that signal in a sense. And what you want to do is there is a prayer to the fixed stars, and it's an Orphic hymn.
There you go.
I like to say it where I feel it in my chest. And instead of saying the fixed stars, you can replace that with the name of the fixed star. Cool. I light a candle and some incense. I try to go out if I can see the star. I try to go look at it. I sing this prayer as much as I can. And then I like to take out a tarot deck, believe it or not, and interview that star. And I do this over a period of time to kind of get to know that star and get into relation with it. They would use various forms of divination. For example, senet sticks. I believe they also use like shells in Egypt, right? If you're not really into that, or you haven't done like ink based divination, which I'm currently learning with Reverend Zemi's class over at the Blackthorn School.
It's a pit, but it's a wonderful pit. But man, yeah, you start digging there, it just goes, it's vast.
It goes so deep, but
Yeah.
I'm starting to learn it, and I'm like, I don't know what this is. My hands are dirty now, so I'm just going to pull out a tarot deck. So you can do that. If you scry, you could scry as well. But the point is to try to get into a good conversation, right? And I like to record that down. I might bring out an offering. Libations are good. All of them like wine. They're not particularly picky for most of them. And just start getting into that relationship. You'll start to get different answers over time. And that's pretty crazy. Very specific too. So I like to ask, like, what kind of relationship do you want us to have? What do you have to teach? What would you say your limitations are? How do you want to receive devotion? For example, some stars are very into the intellectual aspect. Some are much more into the actual performative aspect. Some are like literally just lay down and conceive of me. If you get the Four of Swords, like dream work is almost always the thing, right? But it helps me to have an interface with them because I'm not a star. So finding a common ground or image-based something that I can use to communicate is the first step. So I would do that for a few months. Then you get into learning how to time for doing the actual magic. Right. This is complicated.
Yes.
There are a lot of rules. There are classes out there. Hint, hint, I'm getting ready to launch one in April. Nice. I am also doing something with heliacal stars because that's separate. That would be through an Egyptian thing where we are now going to elect using the heliacal rise because it's touching the horizon of the earth in a visual way, very directly. That light's being translated. You don't have to have a translator of light. But there are conditions for it. You want to make sure that things are okay. Big thing is you don't want afflictions. And afflictions would be like aspects with Saturn, Mars, the nodes. If it's not angular, if the moon's not making a proper aspect to it, it gets very complicated very fast. But essentially, you time your operation. It's usually this really teeny tiny window.
Yeah.
Depending on how you're making it, could be a talisman, so like a ring, right? Where you're going to inscribe usually an image. You can find those in like Picatrix or Agrippa. Sometimes you can make your own sigils and then, sit there and divine on it and ask the planet or the star in question, like, does this look good to you? Does this speak to you? Are you okay with this, right? I do that a lot, especially with corresponding herbs, because there's usually an herb corresponding to it and a number of candles corresponding to it, if it's in Agrippa, if it's in the Picatrix.
Right.
But let's say it's not, which is my favorite topic.
The sacred book of Hermes to Asclepius. There's lots of decan stuff in there as well.
Yeah, so when it comes to decans, that is very Greek at this point, the way that we're using that for magic. It's not going to be based on the stars almost at all at this point. But that also has its own set of crazy rules. Every single type of astrological magic is extremely precise. It's all about timing. Fixed stars are the easiest elections, in my opinion. Has the least amount of conditions, gives you the most number of options. But there are a number of stars not included in these old texts because they really stuck to the 15 Bohemian stars. And I have started to play with stars that are not Bohemian, and I can say I'm very pleased with my result. But I took the initial principles and applied them. And then what I do is I literally over months will divine, like, is this plant of your nature? Would you like this kind of stone? How do you feel about this or that? And I let them communicate back with me because it's not just about me and what I want. And I let them communicate in multiple ways. Like if I have something that keeps coming up over and over after a divination session with them, like right now it's swans, I'm like, oh, I guess Denebadij really wants to work with me. Yeah. I should probably look into that, right?
Right.
And it helps me kind of guide. I'm very organic in that way. Just guide my process because I'm in relation. It is an active conversation rather than me kind of looking at a book and just using a recipe.
When I had a conversation with you, when I was trying to ask you onto the podcast, you say, great, this is stuff I really want to talk about. I have one foot in astrology and I have another foot in magic. But then you said, and I hope I'm not outing you here, it was like, but I really want to talk about magic. So this is all really, really great. But I have to ask, as someone who straddles both astrology and magical realms, what is important for us as magicians living here in the 21st century to get to grips regarding older understandings of the night sky? Like, what is the major thesis of trying to interact with this kind of older star magic? As perhaps it's filtered through several Different eras, of course, are going to get that through the Renaissance and whatnot. But what is it about how people understood stars, say from Egypt or Babylonia or even Greece, that can help people with their magic right now?
So the first thing to always remember is context. I have this written up in a little blog post about like how to get started with the stars.
Okay.
Because again, my first kind of like thing that I looked into was I looked at Vega and I looked at Algol because they're major stars in my chart. And if you look up Algol, it's like the most evil star in the sky, brings ruin, you're going to die of beheading. I'm like, what? What? Hold up. I really hope that's not going to happen. Well, you kind of think about the context. First of all, think about the culture it came from. Particularly if during the like Greek Roman period, misogyny just kept getting filled like deeper and deeper into their
Yeah.
culture. And so kind of keeping that in mind, like maybe it's not necessarily that this is an evil star so much as like it was a woman they couldn't control. That's something to keep in mind. Go into the anthropology of something, go beyond just the myth. Why is this a myth? So like a lot of the Greek myths are allegories for how they were conquering various different countries and trying to fortify their defenses. So like when you hear about literally Perseus coming in while Medusa is sleeping, she's not even fighting him, and he cuts off her head. This was the Greeks sneaking into a country and kind of just destroying someone else's culture where there was a fertility goddess with snakes for hair. And they crushed it. They totally crushed it and enslaved a lot of the people, and they turned it into a defensive base to keep out their enemies. And you see this a lot, like Hercules' trials, which were a mirror of Gilgamesh's trials. It was, again, about going out and fortifying defenses. And what they were doing is they were glorifying it so that it would be moral and right, because they had a very big morality dilemma going on.
Yes.
So context is key, because if you get really literal with this stuff, you're going to probably be terrified by most stars because all of them have something that's kind of nasty. The other thing I would say is these people in these books, they were in relationship with the sky. And so what they were doing is they were writing down their observations after many years of being in a relationship, going through a mystery school and developing their own practice. That's why a lot of stuff is conflicting, especially if you get through these different traditions.
Right.
My favorite ever is like Valens and William Lilly just hated Scorpios.
Yeah.
But that was their personal experience. It doesn't mean Scorpio, and I'm a Scorpio rising, we're not inherently evil people.
Right.
They just had bad, situations with them. So my big thing is like learn the principles. Don't take it so hyper literally. Learn the principles and understand like why. Why did they say that the moon had to conjoin the star or be in a sextile or trine to it? Why did they say that this was an affliction? And then use it to open up your own practice and be in relationship with the sky. A good example is they said Alkaid. The Egyptians would say Alkaid especially because at the time Ursa Major was pretty circumpolar, and it still is in many parts of the world.
Right.
Didn't care, right? Don't care. But actually, I use Alkaid in my own practice because it's great for psychic protection. And when I'm in a session with somebody, having a very, very watery domiciled moon, I can definitely just sink myself into their shoes. And now I'm in a quagmire, right?
Right.
So I use Alkaid to kind of help create a very healthy barrier. It's not a negative star for me. It's actually very mother-like, and it has never scared anyone. Whereas if I go with Algol, Algol definitely has a primordial kind of fierceness to her. And if I wear that during a session and someone's not really tuned up to that kind of energy, I definitely watch them just be very on guard with me. And kind of, basically, it kind of reminds me of that horrible Dane Cook comedy bit where he's like, do you know that guy, the weirdo that makes you feel uncomfortable in the office? And you're sitting at the vending machine and he walks in and you're like, hey guys, want to get the fuck out of here? And you're like crawling behind the vending machine.
Right.
That's kind of how they look. They look like they're crawling out of their skin and they want to get the fuck out of there. So like I have to pick and choose like which entity will work best for this situation. But I only know that from experience. I have friends who have felt like Regulus is very, very dominating. Mm-hmm. I have not had that experience. I have felt that Regulus is very sunny and kind of lifts me up and makes me feel very comfortable in my own sovereignty. So, I mean, it's going to be different for everyone. Get in that relationship. Do the thing. But be careful with timing. Timing is everything. These things that you make, whether we're talking about like oils from Sphere and Sundry or perfumes or actual talismans, they live a very long time. Why would you rush that? If you were going to make an afflicted talisman, it gets to live that way. First of all, have some compassion. Right. Do you think that it wants to live that way? Secondly, think about the outcome for your life. Isn't it worth waiting a few more months or just wait for a different election altogether to get a better outcome?
Right.
If you want to practice, do paper talismans. They're very temporary. But if you want something that's going to live a very long time and have a very profound effect on your life and be a very good relationship for you, be careful with it. Take your time. Learn deep. Go deep and wide simultaneously, because that's where you're going to find the gold, so to speak.
Yeah.
And anyone who rushes it tends to really regret it. Celestial magic is potent stuff. Probably some of the most potent stuff I've ever messed with.
Yep. It was important to them back in the day. It might as well be important to us now. And I don't think we get to decide what was important for them, because we have records and we have monuments built to matching the earth with the sky. And we can definitely, I think it's beyond speculation at this point. To build up on something you said to try and understand why they came to their understandings. I think that's great. I think a lot of my gold that I got from understanding what the ancients got from the stars was to understand how exactly they did that. And the understanding that from that goes to really deep mythological as well as archaeological understandings of what they did, specifically for the Egyptians, and understanding something like the Heb-Sed festival, that the books from Jeremy Nadler goes through all of this kind of stuff. But to understand, even to go back to something that Amaya talked about how they would move the statues, like that speaks more to me about an understanding of how important the stars were to these cultures and how they utilized this kind of understanding or relationship, truthfully, the night sky. I find when I start digging into that, which you're not going to find in a ton of astrology books,
Mm-mm.
you're going to have to go to lots of different sources to try and find this information. But when you do, you realize that a lot of them didn't see themselves as being separated from the sky. And that is, I think, an incredibly important distinction to make. And I don't think we're that separate from them now, even though we live in a city where we can barely see them. I don't know if you would agree with that at all, Amaya.
I absolutely do. And you're 100% correct. And I mean, how could we deny how important it was that the Egyptians would make their buildings on top of mechanisms to move them? And that was like astounding to be like, we'd always wondered how we had these maps of Egypt that were relatively close in time, but totally different. How? Even with the biggest slave force on earth, there was no way they were taking apart and rebuilding these buildings over and over again. No, they were moving them. To build your buildings on top of something, to move them so that they face the correct direction for a star as their sky kept moving. That's how important it was, that you would move an entire city around. That's a lot of effort to go to. And so to deny that is, honestly, it's mind-blowing if you think about it from a scholarly perspective. Like, oh, it's superstition. Really, so superstitious that they moved entire cities?
Right.
I don't think so, my friend. Yeah. And it definitely affects us. Once I started getting in sync, and this is my whole practice in a nutshell, when you get in sync with time and space, you don't even have to do that much magic. Now you're just in relationship. You get into this slipstream and things start to happen in a way that is for you. And the more you lean into that, the less you struggle, the more profound your life becomes. And it's very much that kind of idea of, again, Heka, that daily magic where you wake up and like, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, I said to my guides the night before, I was like, it's frog season here in Ireland. I would really like to have more relations with frogs. Literally the next day, a frog was on my doorstep. My girlfriend was like, there's a frog outside our door. We'd never had that happen. We actually live in like, a normal kind of suburban neighborhood. Right. It was nowhere close to where it should have been. I don't know where this frog came from. I had to relocate it. And it was magical. Just that one little thing. Yeah. And I had another podcast that I was on with Matt Stansbury, which we love. And
Matthew's the best.
We love him so much. And he was in the middle of, we're talking about this tarot card, and suddenly this chorus of toads and frogs starts rising up from the creek. And he was like, okay, I guess this is happening right now. And I was like, yeah, I did ask my guides for more contact with frogs and toads. So it's like, when we get into that slipstream, we have that good relationship. Things just naturally occur without me having to sit here and do this whole huge operation. Yeah. But when I need to do the huge operation, my results are crazy because I have this phenomenal relationship with time and space and the entities and non-humans around me, so that it's not difficult. I used to do like really intense, like ceremonial type of magic, and I would walk out and be dead on my feet. Yeah. Like the energy would move through me and I'd just be and collapse, right? And kind of be out for a week or so. I don't have that happen. I might get tired after initial operation for about 24 hours just because you do have this surge of energy around you. And then I'm back on my feet and I'm good to go. Right. And that's amazing. to not have to magic yourself into every situation because you were just living in that slipstream where magic is basically a relationship. That's all it is. It's this deep relationship where you are in sync, again, with time, space, and non-human unseen entities. That's all it is. It sounds so simple, but it's really difficult because we're not good at it anymore.
No. The stars are there for us to use. I said it on the podcast where I had back on Tarnis on the show. For people that are hesitant about astrological based magic, or even bringing astrology into their magic, it is a eat your veggies type situation. It was important to these people, and it has been important for everybody. And why not? They are there to be utilized and not like conquered in some kind of a way, because you can't, and they'll beat you every time. But
oh yeah,
every time. But don't even try to think about it. We have to understand that it's so readily available to us, and through several things that are somewhat easy to do, you can go from a 5 to an 11 out of 10, basically. So
really, it is. I mean, it's crazy what you can do with it. Absolutely crazy.
Amaya, thank you so much for being on the show. Tell us, what do you have coming up for yourself? What's going on in your world?
So April, I'm launching a community that is all about like animism and stars and astrology and magic, and I'm excited about that. I have been asked that literally for almost 2 years now, so I'm excited to get that going finally. I'm doing a fixed star class where we're going to learn about more of the Egyptian style way of using the stars, but also how do we do magic with it? Because there's not a lot of instructions on that.
No.
A lot of what you're going to find, like Agrippa Picatrix, is going to be that, projected degree onto the ecliptic, which is not a bad way, by the way. And I have done a lot of magic that way. I just have found when you use the heliacal riser culmination, totally different ballpark. Yeah, I'm actually I think it's this week. My partner and I are launching a candle magic class because we're just overly ambitious. So
why not? More work. Nothing wrong with that.
Well, it doesn't feel like work if you're having fun, right?
There you go. That's what I try to tell myself every day when I'm working on a video for 48 hours straight. Where can people
find... We love what you do.
Oh, thank you. Oh, well, stop, everybody. Where can people find your work, Amaya?
Heartwarriorpath.com. And then if you want to follow my very non-professional musings, you can find me on Twitter at Feral Venifica, which is impossible to spell. FERALVENEFICA. One day I will change it. And you can find me on Instagram at the same Heart Warrior Path. So pretty cool if you want to get in relation with me. I'm pretty good about answering. I'm definitely not one of those snotty social media people that's like, oh, stranger, I shall not speak with you.
I can't wait to get to that point. Like that's people like, I'll never become that. It's like, I can't wait to aspire to do that. Just kidding. I love answering everybody's emails, no matter how many times you tell me about the difference between black metal and death metal. Anyways, I'm just going to say that.
Well, you're so generous, and we're so lucky to have you, Doug. Really, we are.
Stop it. You don't have to wax my Corvette. I'm just doing... I'm just doing what I feel is good, and I'm just trying to help people, truthfully, and share more than anything. Amaya, I will have links to all of your stuff up on the website and in the show notes. Can't wait for people to get involved in these classes. Everybody loves also to give some back. Everybody loves what you have to say, and you're incredibly pointed, but also eloquent in sharing the things that you're enthusiastic about. Those are my kind of people that don't try to mix things up with a whole bunch of gobbledygook, but you can actually read their enthusiasm about things that you know that they absolutely love. In your case, whether it be through necromancy, which is a great love of mine, through to animism, which is also a great love of mine, and the stars, it's all there in everything you do. So thank you, truthfully, for all that you do as well. And I hope that people will check out your work and get involved and be part of this sharing that you do as well.
I'm speechless, Doug. I don't even know what to say to that. Thank you. That's so generous of you.
I will have links to all of the ways in which you can find Amaya Rourke's work up on whatmagicisthis.com. That'll be Heart Warrior Path, her website, as well as her Twitter account and her Instagram account. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find links to show notes. I go out of my way for these show notes. There's going to be some really awesome stuff to dig into on this one, as well as some stuff that might be a little bit weird, but definitely check them all out. They're always worth looking at. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find links to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, and my Facebook account. Look those up. If you enjoy the show, please tell a friend, and then perhaps they'll tell a friend, and then they'll tell a friend. And that's how the show works. As far as its marketing, I don't do very well at promoting myself, so word of mouth is, I think, best. And if your friends are like you and they like the weird stuff, then perhaps your friend will enjoy the show. Also, if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review either on iTunes or on Stitcher or any place that you can basically leave a review for a podcast. People do read those reviews, so hopefully if you leave a really nice one, somebody will click on the podcast and they'll be tempted to dive right into What Magic Is This? At least that's the hope anyway. If you want to support the show, I have a Patreon account. That's patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. I put up a ton of new content every month. I just released an episode about decans. So what Amaya and I were talking about today, as far as decans, I put something up there as a video. It's going through a computer screen, but it's still got some really interesting information on there. So definitely check out the Patreon account. Yeah, this is pretty much the only thing I've got going right now with this podcast. And people seem to love it, and people are signing up. So I hope that if you do want to support the work that I do, best place at doing that is Patreon. Audio episodes, I put up polls for people to choose the topics, like this one that we talked about today, the ancients and the stars. That was picked by my Patreon supporters. Also polls on what kind of content you want from me each month. I also have a Discord server up there, so if you join Patreon, you're welcome to come into the Discord and you pretty much have direct access to ask me any question that you want, and hopefully I'll answer it pretty quickly. So if you want to support the show, it's $7 a month. That's it. That's all I'm asking for. Patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. If you're not a fan of the whole Patreon thing and you just want to throw a couple of bucks my way, whether it's $5, $10, $20, $500, $5,000, I have a PayPal Me account as well. It's up on the website. Just click on the little PayPal button, or if you go to the menu, it's under donate. And yeah, you can donate me any kind of money. But if you do want the exclusive content, you're going to have to sign up for the Patreon, which I am on constantly, and I'm always producing new content up on there. So yes, all of those things are available at whatmagicisthis.com. And Amaya, I hope that if I was to ask you to come back on the show, you would.
Oh my God, in a heartbeat. You are a pleasure to talk with. Thank you so much, Doug. I've loved this. And this has been the highlight of my month, honestly. I've been waiting for this. I'm not kidding. I would not lie about that. I'm too much of a Scorpio rising for that.
Okay, wonderful. That's the show, everybody. Thank you so much. And much thanks to Amaya for coming on the show. Come on back to What Magic Is This? We're going to talk about more of the stars, and the moon, and the sun, and the things beneath it that include us. But until then, I want you all to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We will talk to you soon. Bye-bye, everybody.